بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على نبينا Muhammad وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم أما بعد. To continue in the study of Usul al-Fiqh, then last week we entered into the chapter of Al-Hakami, which are known as rulings that the legislator has placed for the ruling. What the legislator has placed for the ruling from the different attributes and signs to prove its validity or the absence of. And so we discussed last week as-sabab, al-shart, and al-mani'. Now a benefit they want to mention before we enter into the new lesson, discussing more of these different types of rulings, that Shaykh Al-Uthaymi mentions, rahimahullah, that everything regarding acts of worship and in contracts and in the legislative rulings and the rulings pertaining to penalties, they are not complete until its means, the asbab, its conditions, the shurut, are met and the preventative affairs are absent, meaning the mawani' are absent. So for an act of worship to be correct, or the dealings and contracts, you must meet the asbab, the means that we discussed last week, the conditions, and also the preventative affairs must be absent. And he says this principle is a beneficial principle. So for an example, if we discuss the acts of worship, if a man is praying and he prays without wudu forgetfully, he forgets he didn't make wudu and he prayed, then after it is clarified to him after that he prayed without wudu. We say his prayer is not correct due to a condition, a shart, not being met, and that is wudu. Because from the conditions of the prayer is having wudu. So if that condition is not met, then the act of worship is not correct. Another example is if he prays at a time when it is not allowed to pray. I mean, the different times when it is prohibited to pray. So if we take, as an example, a man, he sits in the masjid, and after the Asr prayer, he decides he wants to stand up and pray in unrestricted voluntary prayer, meaning one that does not have any reason to be prayed. Just he wants to pray 2 rak'ahs voluntarily. Then we say this prayer is not correct because there is something preventing its acceptance, and that is praying in the time of prohibition. So here we have a mani', something preventing the correctness of that prayer. And if we were to discuss business dealings, for example, an individual sells a product with an unknown price, with a price which is not known. We say this transaction is not correct because a condition is not met, and that is selling it with a known price. So this is something important that we understand, that in act of worship you must meet the conditions of its acceptance, and also make sure that the preventative affairs are absent, and if there are asbab, that the asbab are met. So today we'll discuss al-illah. Al-illah is, if present, then the affair must be present, and if not, then the affair is not present in of itself. What is intended by illah is generally translated as a reason. An illah, a reason which has a text. I mean, there's a textual evidence we have that shows us this is the reason for such and such. Then there's no doubt that the ruling follows it if it is present or absent. If present, the ruling is present, and if absent, the ruling is absent. And there's no differing in regards to this amongst the scholars from what we know, as Shaykh Al-Uthaymi mentions, because the legislation ruled with this ruling, clarifying this illah, this reason. Example is that the Prophet ﷺ said, when 3 of you are together, 2 of you must not converse privately, ignoring the third till the number increases, lest the third should be grieved. So here we have a reason for why when 3 people are together, they should not converse privately and ignore the third person. Why? Because it might cause him to grieve. So this is the reason, this is the illah. The illah for why we're not allowed to do so is that the third one might become sad and cause him grief. Now, Shaykh Al-Uthaymi mentioned if 2 of them are conversing instead of the third, but it does not grieve him and sadden him, this act that they are doing, then do we say is it prohibited upon them to converse as such? The answer is no. Because why? The reason why it is prohibited is so that he does not grieve. But if he's not bothered by it, then the illah, the reason, is no longer present and is absent. So thus meaning that's not prohibited. And if 2 of them do not converse privately, but they both speak loud, but in a language that the third does not understand, and we know that the third one is being harmed by this, then the ruling is present and affirmed, and that is prohibition. Because the reason, the illah, now is present, and the ruling follows the reason, the illah. So this is a good example to show that the illah, if it is present, if the reasoning for that ruling is present, then the ruling is present. But if it is absent, then the ruling is absent. So here we have three individuals. Two of them decide they want to converse privately. The third individual is harmed by this and wants to join the conversation, but they are conversing privately, so he is harmed by it, and it causes him grief. In this case, we say what they are doing is not allowed, because the illah, the reasoning for why this is not allowed, is present, and that is that it is causing him grief. But now let's say two of them are conversing, and the third one, he has no feeling towards it, and he is okay with them conversing privately. Then in that case, the illah is no longer present, and it is permissible for them to do so, because it is no longer causing him grief. The illah is the grief in this instance, in this case. Then the author mentions as-sahih. As-sahih, or acts of worship, are contracts. As for if we discuss as-sahih in regards to the acts of worship, a act of worship which is valid, as-sahih, correct and valid, is an act of worship which by it the responsibility is fulfilled by meeting the requirements. So one fulfills the responsibility by meeting the requirements, meaning he is no longer obligated to perform the act anymore, because his act is valid and correct. As for when it comes to contracts, they meet the requirements for things such as permitting marital relations, the transfer of wealth, or benefiting from it, or similar to it. So those acts of worship, when a scholar says that this act of worship is sahih, or that there's sihha, that this act of worship has sihha, meaning it's correct and valid, then what that means is that the responsibility is met. The individual, his responsibility is completed, and that seeking of the act of worship from him is now dropped, meaning his act of worship is correct and valid. It is not sought for him a second time. Example, you pray dhuhr, meeting all the conditions, and not have any preventative affairs, and you pray that salah, and that salah is correct. Now you've met the responsibility of praying Salatul Dhuhr on that day, and there's no longer seeked from you to pray a second Salatul Dhuhr on the same day. The opposite of that is Al-Fasid, that which is invalid and corrupt. Now, an invalid act of worship is that the effects that do not result from an act of worship are a contract, meaning they do not fulfill the obligation. So if your prayer, example, is invalid, like when the Prophet ﷺ said to the man, "Irji' fasalli fa innaka lam tusalli." Go, return and pray again, for you have not prayed. Meaning when he prayed the first time, his prayer was not correct, because he did not meet some conditions. So he was commanded again now to re-pray. Meaning because why? The responsibility was not met, and the seeking of the act of worship was not dropped from him yet. So he must go and re-pray. So that act of worship was not valid. So if an act of worship is shown to be invalid, or a contract is shown to be invalid, it is not something that the responsibility is met and is seek from him again. So example, if a scholar says that this act of worship is valid and correct, mean that the responsibility is met, and the seeking of the act of worship from him is dropped now. But if he says that this act of worship is invalid and corrupt, then the responsibility is not met, and the seek of it is not dropped. Now, when we discussed example regarding contracts, example we said, as for in contracts, they meet the requirements for things such as permitting marital relations. Now, it is well known that it is not permissible for a woman to marry herself off. She must have a wali, a guardian. As the Prophet ﷺ said, "La nikah illa bi wali." Now, if she were to do so, marrying herself off, what is that marriage considered? A marriage which is sahih, valid, or a marriage which is fasid, invalid? It is a marriage which is considered invalid because the responsibility is not met, or the conditions and the requirements of that contract are not met. For that reason, when you see the scholars discussing this affair, I will mention this fatwa of Shaykh bin Baz to clarify that these terminologies and these words are used in the fatwa of the scholars. So if you were to understand them and what is intended, and understand them more deeply, you understand what the scholar is intending. So, example, he says, Shaykh bin Baz says, "Al-aqd biduni wali aqdun fasid. هذا على الصحيح الذي عليه جمهور أهل العلم." That the contract without a wali, the marital contract without a wali, is a marital contract which is fasid, invalid and corrupt, based upon the correct stance which the majority of the people of knowledge are upon. ليس للمرأة العقد على نفسها. يقول النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم لا نكاح إلا بولي. It is not permissible for a woman to marry herself off. For the Prophet ﷺ, he said, there is no marriage except with the guardian, the wali. So this meaning here, that the requirements are not met here. From the requirements of the marriage for the woman is that she must have a wali. And it is not met here, so that is fasid, it is corrupt or invalid. Then the author mentions Al-Rukhsa. Al-Rukhsa is that which is affirmed in opposition to the legislative evidence due to something else opposing it, which is superior in this case. Now this definition, some of the scholars have taken this definition and said that it is not the best definition for Al-Rukhsa. Because here we are saying that which is affirmed in opposition to the legislative evidence due to something else opposing it, which is superior in this case. Rather, they say that the better definition is that we say that Al-Rukhsa, the concession, is that which is affirmed that it is permitted from the legislator in opposition to the resolution, to the azima, which we'll discuss after this one. So example, we have ghusl al-rijlain, washing the 2 feet. This is called azima, meaning it is a resolution, it is a must to wash 2 feet, it is wajib when making wudu. But now we say, what if an individual wears socks whilst being in a state of purity? Then this is a concession, because it is proven from the legislation that this is permissible. That if one wears socks based on while being in a state of purity, that it is permitted for him to wipe over those socks. For the one who is a non-traveler or a resident, 24 hours, and for the traveler, 72 hours, permitted for him, so long as he meets the conditions. So this we say that the one who wears socks in the state, he wipes over them, and this is a concession for him. Whilst the azima, the resolution, is that he washes his feet, which is obligatory. But now we have an affirmed something, an evidence affirmed that the legislature has permitted now, instead of washing the feet, for the one who meets the conditions, that he can wipe over his socks. Similarly, you find that many times when the scholars discuss traveling in the month of Ramadan, they say that the one traveling in the month of Ramadan, that breaking the fast for him is rukhsa, a concession. He is permitted to break his fast as making it easy for him. As making it easy for him. So it is permissible for him to break his fast if he is traveling, as a form of concession for him, and that is permitted. Whilst if he was not traveling, then it is a must that he fasts. Now the rulings which enter into the affairs of al-rukhsa are wajib, mandub and mubah. We discussed those 3. So the affairs or the rulings that enter into this affairs of al-rukhsa are either wajib, mandub and mubah. Because you cannot say that we have permissibility to do something which is haram or makruh. So that which is al-rukhsa must enter into the chapter of either wajib, mandub or mubah. You cannot say I have a rukhsa, a concession to do this haram affair, or I have a concession to perform this makruh affair. No, rather it only falls into wajib, mandub and mubah. Then the last one we'll discuss for today is al-azima. It is a ruling which is affirmed with a legislative evidence and does not have something more superior to it opposing it. Now when we discuss legislative evidences, as will come later on, what the scholars intend by legislative evidences, they are the Quran, the Sunnah, consensus, and qiyas analogy. Generally, these 4 are agreed upon. As for the last one, some of the scholars they differed regarding. Now, this ruling al-azima is the origin. meaning nothing has come to oppose it. Nothing has come to oppose it. And it follows all 5 rulings. So this al-azima falls into wajib, mustahab, mubah, muharram and makruh. So example, Salatul Dhuhr, we say is azima. It is a must, it's resolution that you must pray it. Because we have an evidence, a legislative evidence, that is not opposed by one more superior to it, showing us that you must pray Salatul Dhuhr. Now, another example, the sunnah of Dhuhr. We say is also azima, although it is something which is mandub or mustahab. We say that it is affirmed by the legislative evidence and does not have something superior opposing it. So one praying rawatib al-dhuhr is azima. Now also we say fasting Ramadan is also an azima. You must fast Ramadan because we have an evidence from the legislator, or we have a legislative evidence showing that you must pray Ramadan, and there's nothing opposing it. There's nothing opposing it. So one cannot come who has no excuse to not fast the month of Ramadan. He is not sick, he is not traveling, he has no reason to not fast the month of Ramadan, and he says to you, I have a rukhsah to not fast the month of Ramadan. No, rather, here for him is azima, it's a must that he fast, unless he finds a reason to not fast. Similarly, not performing zina, or the prohibition of zina is azima. You cannot perform, or you cannot commit zina, because you have an evidence, a legislative evidence, which has nothing more superior to it opposing it, showing us that you cannot perform zina. It is a must that you stay away from zina and not perform it. Now, Shaykh Al-Uthaymeen, when discussing, does azima enter into this chapter mubah? Because as we know, mubah, either doing it or not doing it is the same. Either doing it or not doing it is the same. And azima is something which is a resolution, it's a must that you perform it. So the Shaykh mentions that it is more correct that al-azim is that which is affirmed by way of commandment or requirement, whether that requirement is for you to do the act or leave it off. Whether requirements for you to do the act or leave it off. As for mubah, then Allah did not command us to do it or to perform it, but rather if one wants to do it, he does it, and if one does not want to do it, he does not do so. So what seems to be correct is that mubah does not enter the chapter of al-azima, but some of the scholars discuss that it does. So these are all of the ahkam, that the ruling which Allah has placed as a means or as a sign or an attribute to prove the validity or the absence of an act of worship. So we have asbab, sabab, we have ash-shart, the condition, al-mani', the preventative affairs, al-illa, the reason, al-sihha, the validity, al-fasad, the invalidity, al-rukhsa, the concession, al-azima, the resolution. So if one understands these affairs and sees that, example, in this chapter, there's a rukhsa, there's a concession. We understand from this that the original state is, no, that you cannot perform this act. But now a text has come showing us that there's a concession. There we could be there's a concession here, and we could take that concession and perform that act. Example, Ramadan. You know fasting Ramadan is a must. But we know that the one fasting has a concession to either break his fast or continue fasting. So we say if he takes the concession, the rukhsa, it's permissible for him and not haram. So these are important chapters that one should try to understand and repeat to understand. For if one understands these affairs, many of the affairs will become easy for him in regards to how to understand the different statements of the scholars. Allah knows best. We'll stop with this for now and start تذكرة السامع والمتكلم.